Round up the posse and head 'em off at the pass in this rip-roaring Wild West adventure. Click subscribe now and listen to Bear Wash War. Chapter 1. Rip Campbell was 21 this second day of the beef drive, when the black clouds hung low from Big Baldy to the Screwjack Halls far south. And now and then, the clouds dropped marching veils of mist and fine rain, into which the big meadowland steers plodded with lowered heads. 21 this day, and under a down-pulled black hat and gay close-woven blanket poncho, Rip was singing as he spurred the chunky gray horse ahead toward Jean Dawes, who was riding point. You could feel like singing on a day like this. You didn't care whether it was sleeting or snowing, raining or sunny. When you'd come 21 and half of a beef drive was your birthday present. Half of 628 head by the final tally, as they strung off the home ground for the leisurely 2 weeks' drive to the Two Rivers shipping pens. Prime steers for the most part, with a few old mossy bulls and cows that had been hazed out of the Salt Creek breaks. Eli Walker had promised it 3 days ago, before riding to Bear Wash with the wagon and old Dudley Myers. You're plenty man already, Rip, but it'll be legal like afore Dudley and I meet the drive at Dripping Springs with the wagon. Eli's gnarled hand had reached for tobacco and brown papers as he growled. Don't seem no time since you was that tough, hungry little button that the blizzard blown in to help me and Dudley save them cattle. Rip had grinned reminiscently as he stood wiry and lean, gray eyes level with old Eli's faded stare. Seems to me like it was a long time ago, Rip had said. A heap has happened since. Eli twisted the end of his smoke deliberately and lighted it before he spoke. A heap. You was just shading 12. I wasn't but a busted-down old brusher squatter with a measly beef bunch that wasn't even paid for. Bear Wash was half a dozen shacks, and free grass laid from the Baldy Range to the Screwjack Malpais. I must have brought the rush, Rip chuckled. Look at Bear Wash now, 6 saloons, a bank, a sheriff, and a boot hill. Every time I ride out, I hear someone else has come into the country. Eli's seamed old face had darkened at things he hated. Getting so a man can't roll out of his boots and stretch without poking some stranger in the eye. Good thing I got here first and took my pick. Then Eli had shrugged. We've done all right, I reckon. The meadowland has got grass and water, and the beef drive this year will bring us good cash money to bank. We've worked hard and ate old jerky and bad beans long enough. The hard days is done. We're in the tall grass and clover, and you've more than done your share. All them lean years without wages, same as Dudley and me. So, I'm going to start you out a man with half the steer money in the Two Rivers Bank in your name. Rip had flared back quickly. Who wants any cash money in the bank? You think I've been hanging around for a big hunk of the fat meat? Rip protested. Shut up. Eli had snapped. I know what I'm doing. And like I told you all this morning, I'm leaving you men to get the drive underway while I ride to Bear Wash with Dudley and the wagon. We'll meet you at the springs. The way you cussed Bear Wash last time you come back, Rip observed, I wouldn't figure you'd hone to see it before Two Rivers. Don't care if I never see it again. Eli had growled. Just looking at the place gets me feeling crowded. But I got business to do, and I might as well get it over with. Maybe you and me will ride on from Two Rivers after the steers is sold. It's time a younger feller like you shoved cash money in his pocket and looked around. You've been working too hard on the meadowland for years now. I've been getting out. Last year I rode to El Paso and Santa Fe. I ain't asking where you been. Eli had snapped. I'm telling you what you'll probably do. You ain't big enough yet to stand and argue with me. I told you, and that's how it'll be. Damn them shotgun pellets in my shoulder. It's going to rain. Rip bit back a laugh. That was old Eli, snorting and bellowing like a tailed-up bull for fear someone would find how soft he was inside. But he knew. Even now, as he spurred his gay through a spit of rain, Rip's throat tightened at the thought of that birthday present. Many a man worked hard all his life and never laid hands on so much money. It was wealth for a young buster just 21. And hard to believe, even now. Rip hadn't expected it. Years back, when that hard-shelled button-wearing two-big hand-me-downs had ridden out of the storm on a stolen horse, the Meadowland sod cabin and the gaunt, stooped old brush buster had meant only warmth and grub for a few days until the weather faired. Helping hold the sorry bunch of cows from a disastrous drift had been no more than even trade for grub. But the few days had stretched into weeks, months, years. The button and the Meadowland had grown together. Old Eli Walker had been one of Quantrell's riders, and before and after that a freighter, gambler, cowhand, handy with a gun from the Mexican settlements in California to the rip-roaring spot on Cherry Creek that had turned into the silver and cattle town called Denver. Eli had come out of it all, an old man with empty pockets and pellets scattered in his tall, gaunt frame from one scar to another, all to ache when the weather was bad. But land and cattle of his own had done something to the old man. Winter evenings, when Eli told yarns of the past, he talked calmly, as a man might speak of things some other man had lived through. But when he talked of the Meadowland, Eli's faded, squinty eyes glowed and his voice grew eager. I had to live to be an old fool afore I dropped my loop on a good thing button. A man ain't a man until his feet stand hard on his own land. The Meadowland ain't much now, but she's getting bigger each year. Like you, button. Ain't no telling what a young one or a good cow spread will grow into if they're handled right. Just keep your eye peeled and watch. Staying around to watch the Meadowland grow had seemed natural to Rip. Before a fellow knew it, the Meadowland was home. The Meadowland's good luck and bad luck were part of life. You sort of forgot that all men weren't square and generous like old Eli, that life was wolf eat wolf, that when you grew up you were going to outwolf them all because of those early years when you'd been kicked around by bigger wolves. Times you did think about it. You were confident you'd outwolf them all when old Eli didn't need you anymore, and you finally left the Meadowland. You'd grown to handle guns in a way that made even Eli grunt with approval. Your half-starved kid body had grown fast to lean, tireless manhood. Eli didn't know about that saloon trouble in El Paso last fall that would have ended in gun trouble if Campbell's fists hadn't beaten a border tough helpless, and then the tough's partner reeling and dazed before either man could snatch his gun. Eli and old Dudley and the newer hands, Gene Dawes, Stu Chance, Ozzie Delaware, Earl Crow, and Cy Perkins, never suspected the cold, wolfish delight that flooded Rip when he thought of that savage saloon fight that had left him cock of the walk and ready for more trouble. Gun trouble, if anyone asked for it. The wolf pup had become a he-wolf ready for the pack. But now, as Rip stopped singing and stared into the misty rain, throat tight at the thought of those steers that were his birthday present, he felt less like a he-wolf than at any time he could remember. Eli had given more than prime steers, more than money in the bank or friendship and hearty words. A part of the old man had reached out to something in Rip that had been frozen, aloof, coldly vengeful ever since. As a terrified kid just coming 8, he had seen his mother butchered by renegades masquerading as raiding Kiowas. As Rip rode up, Gene observed, "You sure pick pretty weather to bust out singing like a canary. Better save it for your night trick, in case we get thunder and lightning. Them old mossy backs is still mad and boogery, and laying off to lead a run." "I've got plenty left over," Rip chuckled. "Ain't you heard this is a birthday?" Gene hunched under his yellow slicker, wet hat brim drooping, and water trickling off his long mustache as he grumbled. "When you get old as I am, you'll groan on your birthdays, kid." Eli knowed what he was about when he went around by Bear Wash with the wagon. Bet he's bellied up to a dry bar now, swapping lies over a whiskey bottle. "Eli ain't had a drink in years," Rip reminded. Gene shifted in the saddle and snorted. "Ain't because he didn't want it. Eli's been taking his liquor kick in building up his cow spread, and getting drier every year like a desert weed in a drought. When it comes time for rain, Eli's dry roots is going to soak up everything in sight. Gene shook water off his mustache and chuckled grimly. I've seen them dry out like that before. And when they finally get set under a gentle pour of whiskey, they sprout flowers and green leaves and howl. I hear Eli talking about the hard days being over. If that ain't medicine talk to break a drought, I never heard none. And I can spot a sly look in that old coon's eye. He had something on his mind when he lit out for Bear Wash. It weren't grub for us or dodging a wet saddle out here with the drive either. It's your own tongue that's hanging dry, Rip grinned. Bear Wash ain't the place Eli would go to do his drinking. He ain't liked Bear Wash since it grew up fast so close under his nose. If he was in Two Rivers now, with the steers sold, you might be guessing right. Eli's earned a case of liquor the way he's worked and done without. Why'd he have to go to Bear Wash then? Had business there. Maybe at the new courthouse. Have it your way, Gene shrugged. We'll know when we meet the wagon at Drippin' Springs tomorrow night. Say, did you hear that? Two faint gunshots had come soggily through the mist veils, hiding the brushy country through which the drive had just come. Sounded like a signal, Rip said, twisting in the saddle and staring back. Ozzie Delaware and Cy Perkins, riding Swing, were looking back also. Several moments passed, and then two more shots rapped unmistakably far back of where Stu Chance was bringing up the drag. Trouble, Gene jerked out. And a little more of that shooting close in, and it will send them mossy horns hightailing. Better get back and see what's wrong. Rip was already reining hard back past the noisy, nervous cattle, past Ozzie Delaware, who was riding fast to head off an old cow and trying to look back toward the gunshots at the same time. Back past the drags that had started to fan out from the gunfire behind them. Stu Chance wasn't at his post, keeping them bunched and moving ahead. Stu might have been shot off his horse. But the horse wasn't in sight either, as two more shots cracked sharply. Rip galloped all of 200 yards on the back trail before he made out Stu's riderless black pony beyond a chaparral clump. Swearing, Rip had his belt gun out from under the blanket poncho before he saw Stu getting to his feet on the other side of the horse. Beyond the chaparral clump, a second horse was easily recognizable as Eli's pet Gray Star. Then Rip saw that a man was visible lying at Stu's feet. Chapter 2. Rip swore again as he raced close enough to note the stricken worry on Stu's angular face. Eli heard out here, miles from Dripping Springs, where he was to have met the drive. Rip brought the running horse up short and hit the muddy ground before he saw that the prone man was old Dudley Myers. Plugged in the lungs and hip, Stu said hoarsely. Look at him. It was there plain enough to see. Old Dudley, white-haired, bow-legged, stooped. He was older than Eli, and not good for much anymore but droll humor and driving a wagon and helping cook. Old Dudley, with his slicker muddy and blood-smeared, and the crimson froth of his life bubbling on a slack mouth as the misty rain patted unnoticed on his wide, staring eyes. He must have cut our sign back there a piece and burred on his horse until he sighted the drag. Stu said huskily. Guess he couldn't make it anymore, and dragged his gun and shot as he took a header off the horse. He's been trying to tell me something about Eli, but he chokes up and can't get it out. Dudley was choking again as Rip knelt in the mud. Rattling gasps shook the frail, hunched figure. Strangling on his own weakness and blood, Dudley was, and not much could be done about it. There wasn't any way to get a doctor, and probably not even enough time to call back the grub wagon that was far ahead with the remuda and give the dying man shelter. Rip lifted the old man's head a little. It helped. Dudley got his throat clear, drew a sobbing breath, and gathered his strength with visible effort. His harsh whisper was clear enough. Get to Bear Wash and stop Eli. He done a little business and took a drink and was off like a wild man. Celebrating about his son, He was whooping for the whole damn town to drink to the feller who's a big cattleman. Stu, bending over the spot, heard him and whistled. Eli never mentioned no son. Always acted like he'd never been married. I told him so, and he called me a old fool and yelled for me to drink to the boy. Dudley gasped. Eli's throwed his loop on a hellacious drunk that's got to be stopped. He have a gunfight before you left? Rip demanded. Dudley rolled his head weakly in a negative. I seen he was set to stay in Bear Wash and likely drink or gamble the Meadowland away, so I got his horse out of the livery stable and started to head you boys off and get someone to stop him afore the Tinhorn gamblers got at him. And just this side of the Bear Wash crossing by the Black Butte, I was bushwhacked. Feller plugged me twice it with a rifle and then rode up to make sure I was a goner. Dudley choked and gasped again, and when the spasm passed he was vastly weaker. Rip had to bend low to hear now. Never seen the feller before. Look near Big Pine. He should have kept away. Why'd he shoot you? Rip asked. Can you hear me, John? Why'd he shoot you? Dudley heard, for his head moved in another negative. But his gasping whisper was not the reply. Get Eli afore it's too late. I'm afeard. Dudley choked again, and Rip's eyes were smarting, and he was swearing in husky helplessness as he watched the old man go quiet and inert in the circle of his arm. Jean came riding up, as Rip lowered his burden to the wet yellow slicker and stood up. I heard more shots. What the devil is it? Jean yelled as he rode up. Dudley was bushwhacked. There's trouble in Bear Wash. Circle the cattle and get the wagon back here for a burying. Rip threw harshly at the older man. I'm riding to Bear Wash. But Jean was already swinging down. Bushwhacked? Who bushwhacked him? He didn't get it out. Jean's long black mustache jerked as he looked down at Dudley and began to swear bitterly. How come someone shot a harmless old feller like him? Where's the wagon? Where's Eli? Ain't that his horse? Eli's in Bear Wash on a drunk, Rip said hoarsely. Something to do with a son he never told us about. Dudley figured he'd better get word to us and started on Eli's horse. He was bushwhacked this side of the Bear Wash crossing. That's all we got from him. Dudley never carried money enough to earn a killing, and never made trouble. On Eli's horse, it might be he was mistook for Eli. Jean suggested. Eli was raising hell in Bear Wash, Rip reminded bitterly. Why would anybody be at the Bear Wash crossing looking for him? It must have been a mistake, Stu put in heavily. Eli N.E.R. Dudley never riled anyone enough to bring on a killin' this way. Mistake hell, Rip said violently. You don't make a mistake down a rifle barrel in daytime. Not twice. You know damn well who you're shootin' and why. Dudley was killed because he was Jump John. And the reason's back there in Bear Wash, where Eli's blowed his top over the sun that's turned up. You men'll have to bury Jump John. I'm going to Bear Wash for the answer. Rip was swinging in the saddle as he finished. Jean plunged over to his stirrup. Wait till we get the drive stopped and the wagon back here and I'll side you, Rip, he urged. Stay with the cattle, Rip told him. Better push on to the springs for the water and grass. I'll bring Eli to the springs. Might as well bury Dudley here. He was like Eli. Always wanted to be off, alone a heap. I'll get my rifle and turn the remuda back. Before Lamapin Jean could answer, Rip was spurring away. Ozzie Delaware saw him coming and rode back to meet him. Jump John's death made Ozzie erupt in profane anger. A signal caught Cy Perkins' attention. Jean galloped up. Rip tarried long enough to help start the big steers circling, and then went on to get his rifle and turn back the wagon and remuda. Dudley had died late in the afternoon. Dark had just closed down, the rain had stopped, and patches of moonlight were gleaming through holes in the clouds when the Black Butte loomed off to Rip's right with cloud streamers drifting past the top like strands of misty hair. Dudley had said to look near a big pine. Many pines grew near Black Butte, and more than one big pine stood near the trail. The soggy ground was dark, and there was little chance to find what Dudley had been talking about. Rip turned off the trail to several of the big pines without much hope of seeing anything. It was as good a way as any to spell his horse. And it was the horse, snorting, shying from something on the ground, that located the body Rip would have missed. A flaring match showed the man lying face down on the wet pine needles, black hat half crushed under his head. Rip rolled him over. Another match made clear the thin, fox-like face with a loose mouth under a neat brown mustache. A two-gun man. One gun was still in the hand-stamped leather holster, the other lay beside the body. A bullet had struck beside the left nostril and come out the back of the head. This was what Dudley had tried to tell about, what Dudley had meant when he said the stranger should have kept away. Rip stood there in the black night, picturing old Dudley galloping hard from the Bear Wash crossing while this fox-faced gunman carefully sighted a rifle and fired the death bullet. Old John must have tried to reach cover. The second shot, perhaps, had knocked him out of the saddle under the pine. Like a dead man, Old John must have lain here while the stranger came up to make sure the job was done right. Then Old John had nailed him square in the face. Old-timers like Dudley and Eli were rawhide tough. Dudley had been tough enough to get back on his horse and ride on to find the Meadowland Drive. The dead man, Rip discovered, wore a money belt that held several $100s in gold and a deputy sheriff's badge. Rip was frowning as he put the badge back and shoved the money belt in one of the saddle pockets. If the dead man was a deputy, why wasn't he wearing his badge? If he wasn't a deputy, why was he carrying the badge in his money belt? Answers to those questions were no clearer than old Dudley's murder. The dead man's horse was gone. Wandered away, probably, carrying the rifle that had killed Dudley. Rip was turning back for a final look at the body when his own horse nickered loudly. And over to the left, back in the trees, another horse nickered. At the first sound, Rip snatched his belt gun and jumped for the trailing reins. Then he listened. It might be the dead man's horse, still tied where the owner had left him before ambushing Dudley. The horses nickered again, and wind shook drops from the trees in ghostly pattering. Then silence fell again. The clouds parted and let silver moonlight drench the spot as Rip moved to mount and ride to the other horse. A sharp, high voice behind the big pine froze his movement. "You're covered with a rifle. Stand still." Chapter 3. Under his breath, Rip damned the bright moonlight that made him a clear target to rifle shots only a few feet away. His back was to the gun, too. Nerves on his neck prickled, crawled as he thought how he had stood there striking matches with a gun covering him all the time. He could have been shot down easier than Dudley. "All right," Rip said without looking around. "Now what?" "Drop the reins. Step back with your hands in the air." Rip took 2 steps back, grinning mirthlessly. It had been hard to believe his ears, but now there was no doubt that a woman held the gun on him. "Drop your gun," she ordered. Her voice was thin, tight, unsteady. Clear, though. Any other time, it might have been a pretty voice. "Supposin' I don't," Rip said, listening for sign of a man. But if there were a man, he would have done the talking. "I don't want to shoot you like a dog." She sounded close to tears, as if nerves were ragged and tight, and her unsteady finger might press the trigger any instant. And she added, "Shooting is too good for you. They'll know how to settle you in Bear Wash." "Here goes the gun," Rip said. The moonlight still flooded on him. The soft thud of the gun on the mat of pine needles was audible. "Now step back away from it." Rip stepped back without trying to look around. "Mind telling me, ma'am, How come you're out here by Black Butte this time of evening? It ain't a place for a woman. If I hadn't met his horse heading back home and followed up the back trail, I wouldn't have caught you robbing his body. The rope they'll put around your neck will be too good for you." She must have been standing just beyond the pine trunk all the time he'd been examining the body, Rip thought. Not half a dozen steps away. One easy shot would have finished him, and she'd been in the mind to do it. "Lady," Rip said over his shoulder, "I don't rob dead men. Ain't you a little hasty about a rope around my neck?" The damp pine needles were noiseless under her movements. The rifle muzzle was prodding Rip's back before he knew she had come out from behind the pine. Her voice was bitter, scornful. "You sneaking thief. I saw you take his money belt. And you knew where he was. I saw you come along the trail looking for him. One of your friends must have shot him, and you came back to rob him." Rip whistled softly. "So that's how you got it figured? He your husband?" "I haven't any husband. He's my brother." She jabbed fiercely with the rifle. "You hear me? My brother. Shooting's too good for you. Hanging's too good for a miserable thief like you." "Sister, huh?" Rip said, and his voice hardened as he thought of old Jump John. "I might have known. Bushwhacking's more in the family line, ain't it?" "What do you mean?" Somehow, a little of the anger was gone as she put the question. "You ought to know if you've growed up a sister to him," Rip said harshly. "Don't tell me you don't know he was a skunk. A man don't get his age and turn bushwhacker in a day. He's killed his men and run a dirty trail before, and the family must have known it. He got what was coming to him, and if there's any more like him in the family, they'll probably end up the same way. Get that gun out of my back. I don't hurt women." The rifle muzzle stayed hard in his back, but her voice changed to huskiness, to something close to fright. "Who are you? What are you talking about?" "I'm Rip Campbell from the Meadowland. I rode here from our beef drive to Two Rivers. One of our men was coming from Bear Wash to meet us when your brother bushwhacked him here. Old Dudley killed him and managed to find us and tell us before he died. I wasn't robbing the body. I took the money belt to give to the Bear Wash sheriff. Your brother asked for what he got. Killing me won't help. The Meadowland men know about it." "So that's what happened?" "That's what happened," Rip said harshly. I believe you." "Thanks," Rip said ironically over his shoulder. "You don't take that belt to the sheriff," she pleaded. "I'll take it if I can get there, lady," Rip promised grimly. "Stand still. Don't try to follow me," she gulped. She was crying, in soft, racking sobs that she seemed to be trying to conceal. Despite the grim memory of Dudley, Rip's anger vanished. This woman sounded young, and suddenly helpless in grief and hurt. The gun left his back, and she was gone. Rip swung around and glimpsed her running out of the moonlight into the dark shadows beyond the pine, back toward the horse that had nickered. She stumbled slightly as her foot slipped and kept on, a slim, small figure with both hands still clutching the rifle. The whispering sound of her sobs came back for a moment, and then she was indistinct and vanishing in the night shadows. A dead stick cracked, her horse nickered again, and then the stamp of hoofs, the crackling of branches marked her spurring retreat on the horse. Rip stood there alone with the dead man. He could have followed her, and perhaps been shot at. A woman in her state might do anything. Helpless and crying, trying only to get away from him. As if he were guilty of her hurt. He didn't know who she was, but he was sure now that she hadn't realized the dead man was a killer. And she'd believed Rip Campbell's angry words without question. Believed and fled. "Didn't even give me an argument," Rip muttered, scowling down at the dead man. But the dead couldn't hear or answer back, and the girl was gone. It would be hard, and maybe dangerous to try to catch her. She must live this side of Bear Wash. It wouldn't be hard now to find out who the dead man was. And meanwhile, Eli Walker was, in Bear Wash, maybe in trouble. Rip left the dead man there under the big pine and started on toward Bear Wash. And the bleak, cold anger at Jump John's killer was grimmer now, and he couldn't get his mind off that sobbing, fleeing girl. Chapter 4. Bear Wash was a raw, new town that had mushroomed at the fork of Salt Creek and Blue River. When, years ago, old Eli had brought his mortgaged cattle onto the lush grass north of the Screwjack Halls, Bear Wash had been only a few shanties and a trading post. When the button named Rip Campbell had thrown in with the meadowland, the last Indian outbreak had just been cleaned up to the west. Gold had been discovered in the Caheta Mountains, 150 miles farther west, and the easiest way for the freight was through Bear Wash. With the Indians out of the way, cattle were safe in the Screwjack country, and the settlers had come fast. Bear Wash had grown as fast and been made the seat of a new country. And on his meadowland land, Eli had grumbled about the rush of strangers that put neighbors within 10 or 15 miles and made Bear Wash, a bare 50 miles away, a raw, wide-open cattle town almost under their noses. It was an hour's fast ride from the Black Butte to Bear Wash. The horse was foam-flecked and blowing hard when Rip dismounted before the Colorado House, the two-story adobe hotel where the stages stopped. Wagons and horses were at the hitch racks along the muddy street. Windows were lighted, indicating that Bear Wash was wide awake. Rip walked stiffly into the hotel and spoke to a fat, gloomy-looking clerk who was seated on a high stool behind the counter, making entries in a ledger. "Where can I find a gent by the name of Eli Walker?" Rip demanded. The fat man started and spilled a drop of ink on the sheet as he looked up and blinked. "You mean the old man who owns the meadowland?" "That's him? Is he around?" "He's been around," the fat man said sourly. His pen tip indicated the long rafters behind Rip. "Peel your eye up there, bub, and you'll see where he shot hell out of the ceiling this afternoon. Said he was going to write his son's name up there, so Bear Wash never forget it. He liked to shot the shirt tail off a preacher that had the room up there." "I ain't bub, and the preacher can look after his own shirt tail," Rip said coldly. "What's the son's name?" "Walker, I reckon. That's the old un's name." "He have the son with him?" "Not as I seen." "Where's Walker now?" "The devil only knows," the fat man said sourly. "I only hope he stays away until he sobers up." Several men sitting in chairs had listened to the conversation. One of them said, "He was at the gold rush a couple of hours ago, going strong. Drinks is free, and he swears he'll have the whole town drunk tonight." "Why don't the sheriff lock him up?" Rip demanded harshly. "If Ben Sheldon locked up everyone that bought drinks for the town," the fat clerk grumbled, "Bear Wash be a hell of a place. Sheldon's got the right idea. He lets them have a good time. Especially when they howdy-do as how they'll pin a few ears back with a stud deck, as soon as they square off at a table with any gents who'd like to learn poker from an expert," the other man drawled. "Sheldon ain't the man to annoy his gambler friends by locking the sucker up, is he?" A weird look came over the clerk's fat face. "That ain't no way to be talking. Sheldon wouldn't like it." "I'll bet not," the speaker agreed in his lazy drawl. He was a clean-shaven, middle-aged man in a black suit, gray hat, and expensive half-boots. His air of prosperity suggested that he came from one of the larger towns. Long, slim hands unmarked by hard work hinted that he might be a gambler. But his lip had curled with disdain when he spoke of the sheriff's gambler friends. The clerk cleared his throat, frowned, and started to say something. Then he pressed his lips together, dipped the pen into the ink, and hunched back over his ledger. "Thanks," Rip said and hurried out. At least Eli hadn't gotten himself into a gunfight. But old Dudley had been right. Eli was on a hellacious drunk that might lose him, the meadowland and everything he had built up in the lean, hard years of his old age. Jean had called the turn, too. Eli had dried out too long. And now the old man was roaring wild on whiskey, at the mercy of any crooked gambler who might be friendly with the sheriff. Rip was scowling as he looked in a saloon, saw no customers, and crossed the muddy street toward another saloon. Ben Sheldon, Bear Wash's sheriff, had been in office less than a year. Rip had seen him only once from across the street, a tall, stringy man with a reddish mustache, a fancy pearl-handled revolver, and a big, fancy white sombrero. Sheldon was a Texas man. He was said to be handy with a gun, and was backed by all the Texans who had settled in the south part of the county. The second saloon had only one customer, and he was not Eli. Rip studied the hitch racks and building fronts along the street for signs of the most life, and ended up at a low adobe building that housed the Stag Saloon. The Stag hitch rack was crowded with horses. Loud voices, laughter, fiddle, and piano music were audible inside. And as Rip walked in, a high-pitched rebel yell keened over the other sounds. A burst of laughter followed. The tall, gaunt, bearded man in a battered black hat and worn buckskin who had given the yell sighted Rip and took a step toward him, whooping, "Another stranger," and walking steady and sober, "Or my name ain't Cole Lark. What'll it be, young feller? You can't stay the only sober one in town." Rip grinned as he allowed himself to be urged to the bar. "Whiskey," Rip said. "I hear Eli Walker's getting the town drunk." Cole Lark whooped again. "Eli Walker? There's a man who'll do for any partner. Knew him on the picket wire 30 years ago. I did, and they weren't airy curriculum made for him then. We're a-drinking to Eli's boy, and I'm keeping them pouring while Eli gets him some rest with a little poker. Barkeep, everybody's drinking. I got the dust to pay for it. Gold's gold in any place you see hit. And I got the gold." His rebel yell split the noise again. "Drink up on Cole Lark and Eli Walker. It's free, and it's here awaiting." Whoops and yells marked the rush to the already crowded bar. The crowd was good-naturedly noisy and drunk. It must have been going on for hours. Rip had never seen anything like it. Eli had liquored up most of Bear Wash. Half a dozen men already were lying helplessly against the walls where they had been dragged. "Where'd you say Eli was?" Rip asked Cole Lark. "In the back, having him a few cards. You know Eli, young feller?" Rip nodded. Cole dropped an arm on his shoulder and grabbed for his hand. "I'm proud to know you, son. Eli's friends is Lark's friends. Get outside that drink, and I'll take you to Eli. He's a-waiting for you, boy. Eli's a-waiting for all his friends. We'll tote him a bottle, and bring him luck with them cards." The drink helped after the wet day and hard ride. But Rip was hard-eyed and watchful as he edged away from the bar after Cole. Chapter 5. The saloon was L-shaped, with the bar in front and the side of the L a long beamed room holding a dance floor and tables. Cole Lark weaved toward a door in a partition at the back. A man drinking beer at a table near the door stood up when Rip and Cole Lark approached. The big white sombrero topping the tall, stringy figure was familiar before Rip recognized Ben Sheldon, the sheriff. Sheldon hitched his gun belt up as he stepped over before the door. "Where you men heading?" he demanded. "Bringing luck and a friend to my old pard, Eli," Cole Lark whooped. "Step in with us, Sheriff, and clean out your guzzle with some real drinking. Beer ain't airy way to be celebrating with Eli." The sheriff blocked the way. "I'm drinking what I like, and the boys in there are doing what they like. They don't want to be bothered. You men wait at the bar. They'll be out when they get ready." Ain't a time when Eli wasn't ready to see his old pard Cole Lark. "He's drying and a-thirstin' for this bottle we're bringing him." "You ain't bringing him anything." Sheldon snapped with a quick loss of patience. I'm keeping order around here, and if the boys say they don't want to be bothered, I'll keep it that way for them while I'm around. Go on back to the bar, like I'm telling you. I don't want to lock you up. Ain't anybody going to lock Cole Lark up for trying to see an old partner. Ben Sheldon's weathered, reddish face was long and angular, with a small, tight mouth. And the mouth was hard now as he bit out, I'll lock you up so damn quick you won't know what happened, old-timer. Don't crowd me, even if you are feeling good. Wait a minute, Rip said, elbowing Cole aside. Nobody's breaking any law by walking in on a card game to speak to a man. Since when did the Bear Wash Sheriff start watching the door for a poker game? Ben Sheldon's angular face reddened. Lippy young squirt, ain't you? Who in hell are you? Campbell's the name. I work for the Meadowland brand. I rode here to Rip was almost clear of Bear Wash when guns opened up across the street and the horse went down. See Eli Walker, and I aim to see him. Anything in your law book that says I can't see him? Ben Sheldon's eyes were set close and mean-looking when you watched them, narrowing and flaming in dislike, as they did now. My law book says you're too damn smart for your age, he said harshly. It's got 6 pages, a handle, and a steel barrel. And I'll bend it over that swelled young head if you don't get back to the bar with this man and stop disturbing the peace. That's final warning. Rip was grinning. He'd grinned like this before, and felt like this inside when the wild fracas had started in the El Paso saloon. It was a hot and surging feeling inside, like fire suddenly roaring up against trouble. Working with the tin horn gamblers, are you? He said, still grinning. Get them hands up. Turn around. Open that door. Ben Sheldon's look had turned venomous as the first words came out. His hand had slapped down toward the fancy pearl-handled gun, but it stopped when he saw the fast-out flip of Rip's old wooden-handled .45. The sheriff's jaw stayed loose in amazement as Rip bit out the orders with the same cold grin. Slowly Sheldon turned and reached for the doorknob. Rip jerked the pearl-handled 6 gun from the holster. Cole Lark had sobered into quick uneasiness. Wait a minute, young feller, he protested. They ain't no use sticking up the sheriff. Trouble ain't Eli's day today. Pick out a spot of floor and guzzle yourself blind, Rip said through his teeth. I'm handlin' this. You, sheriff, hurry up. Lemme see Eli Walker. I'm in a hurry. There'll be hell to pay for this. Ben Sheldon threatened thickly as he stepped through the doorway into a dim passage beyond. Ask for it, and you'll get it, Rip said. Open up that card game and show me Eli. The edges of the second door on the right oozed light and murmuring voices. Then the bright yellow lamplight glowed into the passage, and the voices went silent as Sheldon opened the door and stood there with his hands up. What the hell? A nasal voice exclaimed. Past the sheriff's shoulder, Rip saw a bottle, glasses, and cards on a table under a hanging brass lamp that was wreathed in bluish tobacco smoke. A stud game, by the lay of the cards. 4 players. Eli had his back to the door. The nasal-voiced man was across the table, facing the door. Under the down-pulled brim of his hat, a lean, furrowed face eyed the sheriff fixedly. On the right side of the table, a burly, red-faced man with his vest open and his sleeves rolled up on big hairy arms had been dealing cards. He put the deck down slowly as his head turned on a thick, powerful neck. Under bushy black brows, his eyes narrowed at the doorway. The 4th man on the left side of the table was small, lean, and young. Behind a scanty blonde mustache, his rather handsome face was suddenly nervous as he leaned forward and saw the sheriff. A stack of chips clattered softly as he dropped them on the table. He slid lower in the chair, as if shrinking from trouble. Get up, Eli, Rip said sharply. I've come for you. Eli's voice was thick. His chair scraped back, and he staggered as he started to get up. Who is it? "A damn stranger looking for trouble on account of the old man," Sheldon said harshly. "He drawed a gun on me." "Shut up," Rip said. "Eli, come out of there." Eli caught at the chair to steady himself and lurched around into the doorway, peering to see what was happening. His stooped, spare frame hid the rest of the room for the moment. And back of Eli, there was no warning as a gunshot blasted out the overhead light. Rip couldn't shoot the sheriff in the back, but any tenderfoot would have recognized this as a mess of trouble for Rip Campbell and Eli Walker. "Damn your dirty tricks," Rip swore as he jerked up the .45 to pistol whip the sheriff out of the way. The blow glanced off a shoulder. Sheldon had nimbly dodged aside in the sudden dark as the pressure of the gun left his back. "Duck, Eli," Rip yelled. A second blasting shot in the cardroom drowned the words. Then there was a third shot. A man lurched out of the doorway into Rip and would have fallen if Rip hadn't thrown out a supporting arm. It was Eli, reeking of whiskey and now worse than drunk. Rip jumped back with Eli's sagging weight full on his arm. He fired past Eli at a gun flash inside the cardroom doorway. Eli was muttering something, but the words were lost as other guns hammered a hail of lead out the cardroom doorway. Bullets that would have riddled them both if Rip hadn't moved fast. There was no time now to hear what Eli was saying. Eli was badly hit. He'd be killed, and Rip Campbell too, if those poker sharks had their way. Chapter 6. Rip bumped into Cole Lark as he backed with Eli's stumbling weight. He was throwing shots past Eli at the doorway, where red gun flashes searched after them. The sheriff had disappeared back in the dark hallway. "Get out of the way," Rip yelled, crowding back past Cole with his burden. The numbing slam of a bullet furrowed his left arm, the arm that was holding up Eli. Maybe it meant another wound for Eli. The old man had been hit more than once. His weight was getting heavier. Rip was raging with wild anger. This was like the killing of old Dudley. This was cold murder a second time, without any excuse or reason that a man could see. Murder backed by Sheldon, the sheriff. Eli was stumbling badly, ready to fall. There wasn't a chance to duck for cover and make a stand. Rip's shoulder hit the side of the doorway. He staggered back out of the passage, found the open door with a sweep of his arm and slammed it shut. Beside him, Cole grumbled, "Why'd you have to start trouble that way, young one? What's the matter with Eli?" Eli's knees buckled, and a great groan wrenched from him. "Can't make it anymore, Rip," he gasped. "Let me down and run for it." Here outside the passage, there was dim light from the front of the saloon. Light that showed Eli's weathered, wrinkled face contorted with pain. Blood was spreading over Eli's shoulder. A great red blotch was widening on the front of his shirt. Rip swallowed a groan as he saw that a bullet had gone in Eli's back and torn out big in the front. Eli didn't have a chance. Eli knew it. His look had cleared and steadied. Eli was a sober man now, calling on the last of his strength as he tried to push Rip away. "Cole," Eli gasped. "Here, partner. Help the boy get away. He's my boy. My son. Don't let them get him." "Hell's blazes. Why'n't somebody say so?" Cole Lark blurted. "He never told me." "Sure, I'll watch him." Cole Lark whirled menacingly toward the crowd that was cautiously moving out from the bar into the other end of the L-shaped room. "Get back there," Cole Lark yelled. "Keep out of this. I'll plug the first snake that gets in our way." Concho was sitting on the floor now, supporting himself with a hand, as Rip finished reloading the .45 and cocked the sheriff's fancy revolver in the other hand. "Where's your real son?" Rip asked huskily. "I'll get to him if I can, and tell him. Always wanted a son." Eli wrenched out. Been aimin' for it since you throwed in with me, Rip. I come here to bear wash this trip and made it legal. Lawyer Sanders drawed up the papers, so you'll get the meadowland and all I own. I took me a drink to celebrate, and couldn't stop the celebratin'. Eli gulped and smiled faintly. Ain't every day a old hardshell like me gets a bang-up son he's so proud about. Rip's throat was suddenly tight, so that it was hard to speak. His eyes were moistening strangely, as he knelt there on the rough floor with cocked six guns and looked at Eli's lean, wrinkled face and bowed shoulders. Eli's faded, frosty eyes were clouding now, and yet they were bright too, with a pride and satisfaction Rip had never before seen. You needn't have done it. Rip gulped. You've been better than a father. I'd wailed you a few times when I didn't, Eli said thickly, and managed to smile as he bowed there with a hand over the torn hole in his stomach and blood creeping out over the gnarled fingers. A spasm passed over Eli's face. He fought it away and gasped. Listen while I can talk. It's the only chance I'll get to talk to a real son. You've grown up now. I want you to keep growing. Don't wait like me till you're busted down and wore out afore you get your roots in and start growing. You're young. You can go a long way with the start you got. Savvy? Sure, Eli. Savvy this then, Eli gasped. I aim for you to keep growing head and shoulders over every man you ever knowed. Listen, boy. I'm dying. I can't be with you like I counted on. I aim for you to end up a king cowman that men'll talk about from St. Louis to Frisco. I aim for you to do all the things I should have done and be all the things I might have been. You listening, son? Cole Lark was stamping back and forth beside them, warning the saloon crowd away. The sheriff and gamblers hadn't appeared. They might, any second. Eli's eyes were clouding fast. Rip didn't know where he was getting the strength to hold himself up and pour out the dry, feverish words. Kneeling there with the 245s cocked and ready for the gunfight that might resume any second, Rip nodded again, unashamed tears in his eyes. I'm listening, Eli. I won't forget. You're young enough to make it, Eli said. It'll mean your heart, and your head'll have to keep growing with your bank account. Jealous men'll try to cut you down. Some that seem friends'll try to double-cross you. You'll have to be hard and soft at the right time and sharp all the time. Your feet'll have to stay hard on the ground while you're looking up above where you're climbing. And when you get there, son, I want you to be proud and big with no shame behind you. Savvy? I savvy, Eli, all of it. Eli was looking at him, but the faded eyes had a faraway look, as if Eli already were leaving and straining back for a last look. Eli's voice was fading away, too. No matter where you bury me, son, I'll be looking when you get up there to the top. I'll be proud I pointed you right, proud of old Eli Walker's son. Eli. Rip caught the collapsing figure and eased it to the floor. Eli was gasping. His eyes had closed. He was past hearing now, past caring what happened to Eli Walker. He had gone far on that trail all men travel alone, and was going faster, farther each moment. He's dying. Rip gulped. Like he wanted to, Cole Lark jerked out. Eli used to say he'd like to get it with his boots on and guns smoking close. Ain't no more we see and do, boy. Our skins is next. Let's get out o' here. Rip stood up, blinking, gripping the two cocked six guns. There was no time now to think it all out. There at his feet, Eli was dying. One of the gamblers had shot Eli in the back. And savagely, Rip knew what had to be done. Ride your trail. Rip threw at Cole Lark as he turned toward the passage door. What you doin'? I'm getting the dirty son that killed Eli. No, you don't, Cole Lark said decisively. You're Eli's boy. I told him I'd get you out o' here. That sheriff'll be back to even up the way you handled him. But Rip elbowed past the older man, jerked open the door, plunged into the passage taut and ready to meet triggered guns. But the dark passage was quiet, deserted. The card room held no sign of life. Onto the back Rip ran, guns cocked for any movement ahead. Then suddenly, through another door, he came out back of the building into the open night. Cole Lark was at his heels, protesting. They hightailed to a hole somewhere. You won't find them if you hunt all night. Get out of town, boy. That sheriff will have help by now. You can't gunfight him and his friends all alone and come out with your hair. Where's your horse? In front of the hotel, Rip muttered, peering about, listening. Cole Lark caught his arm and spoke with hoarse urgency. My horse is at the feed barn. I'll get him and meet you out of town on the Drippin' Springs Trail. We'll join your outfit and talk things over. You'll do a heap more with friends at your back and plans made than a chargin' around in another man's town at night askin' for trouble. You go and kill 2-3 of them, and there'll be a dozen more to get you. That ain't what Eli figured. It was only words strung together, words that had no meaning for Rip. Anger, grief at Eli's death had brought that cold, savage, wolfish feeling. They wanted gunfighting. They'd get gunfighting. Go get your horse, Rip said. Don't worry about me. Cole Lark held onto his arm. Still want trouble, don't you? Can't ride away and leave hit to another day. You young hotheads is all the same. Listen. You're Eli's boy. You made Eli a dying promise. Are you going to keep it? The harsh reminder struck Rip like cold water. It was as though Eli were standing there in the dark, with the weight of his gnarled hand beside Cole Lark's hand. Rip wavered, surrendered. I'll meet you out on the trail. Good boy. Keep off of the street till you get to the hotel, and then ride like hell. That blasted sheriff is wantin' you. He ain't forgot how you handled him. Cole Lark vanished in the night. Startled, Rip tried to follow the buckskin-clad man's retreat. He heard nothing, saw nothing. Cole Lark had gone like a ghost. With a grunt of approval, Rip went the other way, cutting back behind the store buildings. The crowd in the Stag Saloon was boiling out into the street. The gunplay, the dead man, the threat of more to come had silenced all but the noisiest ones. Rip heard a few uncertain yells as he ran toward the hotel. He met no one back there in the dark behind the store buildings. Everything seemed quiet in front of the hotel. The horse drooped at the hitch rail. But as Rip holstered his gun and stepped out to the rack, a quiet voice said, "Trouble down the street there?" Rip spun toward the voice. Then he shoved his 6-gun back in the holster as he recognized the clean-shaven stranger in the black suit and expensive boots who had spoken up in the hotel lobby. The man was leaning against the building front now, smoking a cigarette. "I met the sheriff and his friends," Rip said briefly as he turned back to the horse and unwrapped the reins. "Figured you might," the stranger drawled without moving. "Who got hurt?" "The man I was looking for," Rip answered harshly as he reached to the saddle. "Murdered. Shot in the back. Might help you to remember that." "In the back?" "My memory," the stranger drawled, "is good." His cigarette end was glowing red as Rip reined the horse out into the street. Back at the Stag Saloon, there was more noise now as the drunken crowd spread along the street. Back there, too, was Eli Walker, and a score that Rip Campbell would settle before he again slept easy at night. The bitter bite of it was in his throat as he settled in the saddle to ride, and the drumming crash of gunshots across the street was the first warning that he was not getting out of Bear Wash without more trouble. The next instant the horse was screaming, rearing high. Chapter 7. Half a dozen guns, at least, were spurting fire. The horse was badly hit. High it reared, and came down loosely, pitching forward into the muddy street. Rip kicked out of the stirrups, threw himself clear of the saddle, hit the ground staggering, and sprawled in the mud. The 6-gun he had drawn went deep into the mud, clogging the barrel. Rip hurled the gun away as he scrambled up and clawed out the sheriff's gun that was thrust inside his belt. The shots had stopped as the horse went down. Now they started again as Rip came up in the street. A trip hammer blow seemed to tear off the top of his head, and he felt himself falling into blackness that had no bottom. Then lamplight was in his eyes, and men were about him. He was on his back, his shirt off. Someone was working on his arm. The first words he heard sounded far away. His clearing head brought the voice suddenly just above him, speaking in a mild drawl. He was lucky. An eighth of an inch lower would have split his skull like a meat axe. This arm won't bother him much. It gouged out a little muscle, and he lost some blood. But he's young and husky enough to stand it. He'd be better off if he'd leaked all his blood, an angry voice broke in. Because I'm going to hang him and laugh while the rope stretches his dirty neck. I'd have killed him back there in the street if I'd known about him then. He's your prisoner now. Better not lose your head, the mild voice advised. After all, there might be a mistake. Mistake, hell. Witnesses seen him shoot old man Walker. That money belt in his saddlebag is one I give my brother. He had to kill Jake to get it. You trying to tell me he ain't a dirty killer? I'm not trying to tell you he's anything, the mild voice said. A jury will do that. But dead brother or not, Sheldon, you'll do well to make sure he faces a jury. I'm telling you now that he'll be all right in a little while. I suggest you keep him that way. I'll ask for your advice when I want it, Sheldon snapped. Too damn many folks tonight are telling me how I ought to act as a sheriff. The mild voice said, I voted for you, Sheldon. It was my understanding Bear Wash wanted a sheriff, not a judge, jury, and public executionist as you see fit. You'd have killed this man instead of arresting him as he lay there in the street if that stranger hadn't stopped you. A damned lone wolf gambler buttoned into something that was none of his business. He's anotherin' that'll learn to mind his own business. Sheldon, the mild-voiced man said, I'm a voter, a taxpayer, and the only medical man in 3 days' ride. You might remember that. A sheriff can always be replaced. A doctor can't. The sheriff growled something as Rip opened his eyes. The doctor was putting on his black hat. Barely past 30 by his looks, clean-shaven, with a thin, likable face. Ben Sheldon was there and another man, and behind them were jail bars. Rip lifted his head. He was on a cell cot. Half a dozen men, beyond the bars, had been watching the doctor work. One of them exclaimed, Looks like you was right, Doc. He's a rearin' up. I'll handle him, Sheldon grunted. His red face was ugly as he said, Where's Jake's body? Speak up, or I'll choke it out of you. Ask your sister, Rip said with an effort. What's Judy got to do with it? She found the body. She'll tell you, I took the money belt to bring to the sheriff. Not knowing you were brother to a man who'd bushwhacked an old man in cold blood. I don't know what in blazes you're talking about, Campbell. It's a lie, whatever it is. Judy don't know Jake's dead, or she'd have sent word. If you brought Jake's belt to the sheriff, why in hell didn't you give it to me at the Stag instead of pulling a gun when I wasn't looking, and crowding past to shoot that old soak you've been working for? Sitting on the cot edge, Rip was dizzy, sick with the hammering pain inside his bandaged head. The men outside the bars were watching for his reply. The doctor's look was thoughtful. Half an eye could see that even the doctor thought he'd shot Eli in the back. Rip tried to stand up, protesting. That's a lie. One of those gamblers shot Eli. One of your friends. Sheldon pushed him violently back on the cot. That talk ain't helping you. There was witnesses. I saw it myself. We'll put you before a jury and let them hang you. Now everybody clear out. I've got him safe, and I'll keep him safe. Just a moment, the doctor said. What's this, Sheldon, about your brother killing someone? If this feller's got any kind of a likely story, he can tell it in court. Doc, Rip said, looking at the physician, I need a lawyer. Tell Lawyer Sanders to get over here. The sheriff can't keep him out. That's right, the young doctor agreed. I'll get Sanders at once. I don't hold a man from his legal rights, Sheldon growled. All right, men, move on. The sheriff locked the cell door. Alone, Rip hunched on the cot, holding his throbbing head. Eli dead. Ben Sheldon's brother dead. He, Rip Campbell, charged with both killings. The money belt, pinning one murder on him. Sheldon and the gamblers, swearing the other murder on him. Sheldon knew it was a lie, knew who killed Eli. Thinking back, it was easy to believe that Sheldon must have known Eli didn't have a chance. And just now, Sheldon had stopped all questions about his brother, hustled witnesses out of the way. There was more to this than a card game and a killing, if a man could read the sign right. Facts were plain. Eli had started his roaring drunk. Old Dudley had taken Eli's horse and ridden to meet the Meadowland Drive. Jake Sheldon, the sheriff's brother, had shot Dudley at the Black Butte. Sheldon must have followed Dudley out of Bear Wash to stop him. And had almost done so. Almost left Eli drunk, helpless in the hands of the gamblers and Ben Sheldon. They couldn't have planned to kill Eli and lay the murder on Rip Campbell, because they hadn't known Rip Campbell was coming. But while Eli was dying, Ben Sheldon had made no attempt to re-enter the Stag Saloon and arrest the men he was now charging with the killing. Sheldon had gone for friends, had opened fire without warning as his man was riding away. By the doctor's word, Rip Campbell would have been killed there in the muddy street if a stranger hadn't stepped in. All that had happened before Sheldon had found his brother's money belt in Rip Campbell's saddlebag. Before Sheldon knew that his brother was dead. For some reason, Sheldon had wanted Rip Campbell as quickly dead as Eli. You could bet good gold that Sheldon still felt the same way, and not because of his brother. And then you could wonder why. The girl would know, Rip muttered to himself. She said not to take the belt to the sheriff. She knew damned well her brother Jake got what was coming to him. Knew her sheriff brother was up to something snaky. Chapter 8. Sheldon stepped back into the cell alone. The fancy pearl-handled six-gun was in his holster once more. He was scowling as he spoke through the bars. So Jake's dead. Shot by the man he rode out of town to kill, Rip said. You're claiming another man killed Jake. It was Dudley Myers who rode in here to Bear Wash with Eli. Maybe you wouldn't be knowing that. Where's this Myers now? Sheldon demanded. Like to have a try at shutting his mouth, wouldn't you? Go talk to your sister. She found your brother's body before I did. She heard me say I was bringing the money belt in to the sheriff. What did Judy say? Ask her. Sheldon's blustering anger was under control now. His mouth was tight and hard, eyes sharp, wary. He stared through the bars, as if trying to read the prisoner's face. A slow grin twisted his mouth. You brought Judy into this. If you're lucky enough to get into court, she'll help hang you. Wouldn't surprise me, Rip agreed. It must run in the family. Someone entered the front office, and Sheldon turned away. Rip heard voices murmuring for several moments. Then Sheldon brought in a smiling, roly-poly little man in a black frock coat, black hat, and red cardboard note case under an arm. Here's your lawyer, Sheldon said curtly as he unlocked the cell door. He's a killer, Sanders, and it'll take a better man than you to get him out. The lawyer chuckled, bringing little creases over his smooth pink cheeks. He looked plump, jolly, sure of himself. We'll let the law settle that, Sheriff. Lock the door and leave us alone. You bet I'll lock it. And don't take all night. I'm leaving with a posse to to find Jake's body. I want you out of here before I'm gone. According to the law. Sheldon cut him off brusquely. Damn the law. I'm running the jail tonight, Sanders, and I'm in a hurry. When they were alone in the cell, Rip indicated the other end of the cot for the lawyer to sit on, and spoke grimly. Sheldon seems to be the sheriff and the law both around Bearwash. Talk. Only talk, the pink-cheeked little man said cheerfully as he sat down. Now then, young man, can you pay for a good lawyer? Worried about the money already. Lawyers have to live, Sanders reminded shrewdly. I reckon I can pay. Maybe you didn't get the name. I'm Rip Campbell. Sanders nodded. Work for the Meadowland, I understand. I reckon I own it now. Didn't this Eli Walker own the Meadowland? Eli signed papers making me his legal son. Said so in the Stag tonight, just before he died. He told me to see you about it. You don't have to worry then, Sanders said with returning cheerfulness. Where are the papers? You made them out, Rip said. Where are they? Eli signed them. Sanders stood up, smiling regretfully. Walker did say something about drawing up some papers before he left town. Perhaps tomorrow. He didn't sign anything. If that's all the title you have to the ranch, young man, you haven't anything. The little good-humored crinkles in the plump, smooth face were still there, but Rip suddenly realized that the smile held no friendliness. It was a tricky smile. You're lying, Rip charged. Eli did sign them papers. I didn't come here to be called a liar, young man. If you're going to get... Eli trusted you, and you turned snake soon as he was dead. Sanders yelled with fright, tried to dodge in the cramped, narrow little cell as Rip came off the cot. Rip caught him by the throat, slammed him against the back wall, sinking fingers deep into the puffy neck. The lawyer's face mottled as he clawed at the corded wrists. Eyes began to bulge. Eli's dead, but I'll get the truth out of you. Rip panted. What happened to those papers? What did you do with them? Then, outside the cell, Ben Sheldon was shouting, What's the matter here? Lego him, Campbell. Lego, before I gut shoot you. Rip yanked the struggling little lawyer around for a shield. Leads what he needs. Shoot the hell out of him. Cursing, Ben Sheldon unlocked the door and plunged in with his gun. Rip hurled the half-throttled little lawyer across the cell at him. Drag the little buzzard out of here before I break his neck. Tell him he ain't heard the last of this if I'm hung on every gallows from here to the border. I ain't the only friend Eli Walker had. It'll take more than a greasy little lawyer to work the trick he's trying. Sheldon pulled the stumbling, choking man outside the cell, slammed the door and locked it. You get a lawyer, and then try to kill him as soon as my back's turned. It'll take a lynching to settle you, and the quicker the better. Come on, Sanders. I reckon you're through here. Coughing, feeling his neck, Sanders scurried into the sheriff's office without looking back. Breathing heavily, Rip dropped back on the cot. The bullet-furrowed arm was hurting. His head felt worse. Inside, too. For the first time, he felt like a trapped animal. He swore thickly as he rolled a cigarette with unsteady fingers. This afternoon, he'd been Rip Campbell, 21, owning half of a prosperous beef drive. Tonight, for a little while, he'd been Rip Campbell, Eli's adopted son, owning all the beef drive and the Meadowland too. Now, here in the Bearwash jail cell, he was Rip Campbell, Meadowland cowhand, pockets almost empty and a hang rope staring him in the face. Rip swore again. Eli had signed that paper. Drunk or sober, Eli had told the truth before he died. Which made sign that any man could read. Eli had come to Bearwash, left his business with a crooked lawyer, and let whiskey make him a target for every sharper in town. They'd worked fast. They'd gone after Eli's ranch and cattle. They'd shot Eli out of the picture. Now they had Rip Campbell locked up and were ready to hang him. They'd have killed him tonight in front of the hotel if the stranger hadn't stopped them. Rip paced the cell like a caged wild cat. Activity was audible in the sheriff's office. Finally, it stopped. A lanky man with a drooping mustache and a deputy's star pinned on his vest stepped back to the cell and peered through the bars. "Ben's rode out of town, and I'm in charge. Y'all set for the night?" "Coffee'd help my head." The deputy shifted, chewing tobacco into the other cheek, and grinned loosely. "This ain't a hotel. You'll get coffee with breakfast if you ain't lynched by then." Lynched. Heap of folks in these parts thought well of Jake Sheldon. Us Texans stays next to one another. That lawyer Sanders from Texas too. Sure is. Can't all of you be from Texas? The deputy grinned again. The old Lone Star's a big one. Ain't big enough to hold all the crooks, skunks, and snakes I've run into tonight, Rip said. That goes for you too. Get out so I can rest my eyes. The deputy snarled back through the bars. You won't be so damn talky if they get a lynch rope on your neck. And I ain't got no help to stop them if they're minded. Ease your damn head with that. He stamped out. Rip started pacing again. 3 steps one way, 3 the other. Both Sheldon and his deputy had spoken about a lynching. Miss out on killing a man when you arrested him, and a lynch rope would settle everything before he walked into court to tell his side. Rip stopped as something tapped faintly on the window glass. It was the end of a branch tapping the glass. By standing on his toes, Rip could push the window up part way and reach through the bars. You in there, boy? That would be Cole Lark, outside under the window, speaking guardedly. Chapter 9. Rip moved the cot over under the window and stood on it. Get me a gun, he called in a low voice. Coming up all ready, son. Cole Lark had cut and trimmed a small tree branch. The heavier end poked up through the bars, bearing a .45 tied on by a long string. With the gun was a leather pouch, holding extra cartridges. Soon as I heard the shooting, I knew that Polecat Sheriff had found you, Cole Lark's hoarse whisper came up. I got near the spot they had you and was asking where I was. I had to keep out of sight. Ain't a chance for me to get in there and get you. There's a crowd out front. Working up to a lynching? Rip whispered back through the bars. You might as well know hit, Cole Lark agreed. The fools is drunk and believing you walked right in and hold Eli in the back. Them gamblers and the sheriff swore you did. They're all for lynching the hombre who killed the feller that was buying them drinks. Come morning, they'll get some sense. Tonight, there ain't no reasoning with them. And by morning, I'll be lynched. Looks bad if you don't get out of there, boy. The sheriff rode out of town. Ain't nobody to stop them. A friend o' yours named Mitch Hall has tried to talk sense to them and didn't get nowhere. He's bringing a horse back o' the jail here for you. If you can bust out, we'll side you out o' town. Cole spat audibly. If you can't, we'll take a hand and try to get you out. They won't string you up, boy, whilst Cole Lark can work a gun. I done promised Eli. How's your head? Good enough, Rip said. Who's this Mitch Hall? Friend o' yours. He run out from the hotel and made sure you wasn't killed when they had you down in the street. Backed them cold by swearing he'd take on any man who stopped a doctor from getting to you. Sent for the doc himself. I'll be out to thank him, said Rip. And I'll have to leave town fast. They're charging me with double murder. The lawyer says Eli didn't sign any papers today. They're after the Meadowland, too. Somebody will have papers saying that Eli gambled away everything. So that's how it is. The lawyer's a fatty little man named Sanders, Rip continued. Might be. If I could talk to him out of town, there'd be a different story. Fatty little lawyer named Sanders, Cole Lark repeated out of the darkness under the jail window. You ride out the Drippin' Springs Trail and find your beef drive boy. I've toted in slicker game than fatty little lawyers. You'll get your talk with him. Cole Lark's a promising hit. And don't waste your time in there. Them drunken fools is a gathering and a inching up to a lynching. I'm wishing you luck. Thanks. Cole Lark evidently vanished quickly again, for he did not reply. All chambers in the 6-gun he had brought were loaded. Rip shoved it under his belt, closed the window, and moved the cot back. Then he pulled on his muddy coat and buttoned it over the gun. His hat had evidently been left in the muddy street. The left arm was stiff and painful, but usable. His head was feeling better. From the moment the gun came through the window, strength and hope had come flooding back. One friend outside had been all he needed. He had 2. 3, if you counted the young doctor. Rip Campbell had a chance now. For a moment, Rip had the feeling that old Eli was close, watching, waiting for Rip Campbell to fight out of this trouble and start for those heights which Eli had planned. Men might die. Eli might be avenged. But there was more to it than that. More than a jail cell, more than revenge for Eli and smooth trickery. This was the first testing of Rip Campbell, who one day had to be all those things that Eli Walker might have been. And the girl's reply was steadier than he expected. You're the one they want, she guessed swiftly. She was small and slim, and her eyes were unhappy. And Rip would have known that clear note in her voice anywhere. You're Judy Sheldon. She nodded. Got here in a hurry to help hang me, didn't you? Must run in the family. That brought a blaze into her eyes. He'd thought her young, but not so young. Not younger than himself. Looking now, it was hard to believe she'd held him up by the black butte as coolly as a man. I believed you about Jake's money belt, she said scornfully. And you rode into town and killed the man who was hiring you. You know the straight of it. Rip threw at her. You knew the truth out there tonight. Ben Sheldon and his gambler friends did the killing tonight. Pity you ain't a third brother. I'd start on you. They voted for a sheriff last year and got a buzzard. He made the law a gun law. Rip lifted the .45. I'm raising him with 6 guns. Him and his friends, and any more of the Sheldon breed that's running a loop on this range. A drunken yell split the night outside. What are we waiting for? Let's get him. Rip grinned mirthlessly. That would sound good to your brother, Ben. Better get in the back room. The gambler's foot caught in the stirrup as he left the saddle, and he plunged under the hoofs of the maddened horse. 87 These windows won't stop lead. He turned the light out as he spoke. And through the swift blackness that fell between them, Judy Sheldon cried in protest, They'll kill you. Bat Jones is leading them. I saw him when I came in. There must be some other way. I'll help you. Never heard of Bat Jones. And the Sheldons, Rip answered her bitterly, have helped me enough. Get back out of the way. Hell'll be popping in a minute. Rip opened the door. He was in blackness. Cloudy moonlight rushed shadowy pallor over the muddy street outside the jail. Enough light to see the gathering crowd, 20 or more. Some hanging back beyond the hitch rack and spreading to right and left along the slippery plank walk. Most of them liquored up by the noise they were making. And the leaders already close to the jail steps, bunching up behind a broad-shouldered powerful man who had drawn a gun and shouted as the door opened, That's right, Tompkins. Open up. All we want is that young killer. Come out with your hands up, and you won't have any trouble. One quick look placed the men. There was enough light to mark the big fellow shouting at the doorway. He must be Bat Jones. He was the burly, red-faced gambler with the bushy black brows and hairy arms, who had been sitting at Eli's right hand in the back of the Stag Saloon. One of the men who'd murdered Eli. Rip could have opened fire from the dark doorway and riddled Bat Jones and some of the drunken men behind Jones. Dropped them before they broke into the jail. Scattered them in panic for a few moments. But if he did that, in years to come the dead men would haunt him. Many of the drunks were convinced that the prisoner was a killer. Sober, they'd look at the dead who hadn't fired a shot and swear that all charges against Rip must be true. Rip made an instant choice before he moved, and took the greater risk. "Stand back. Don't shoot," he yelled as he dived out of the dark doorway. Chapter 10. Uncertainty stopped even Bat Jones while a man might count 4. In that time, Rip dodged to the right along the front of the jail, cocked guns silent, the hell of gunfire and death hanging by a thread. Then a ball of anger came from Jones. "That's Campbell. Get him." The big gambler's gun crashed furiously at the shadowy figure plunging to the corner of the building. 3 shots came almost as one, while Rip gambled with death to reach that jail corner without killing a man. And maybe he was a fool, and maybe not. Eli would know. A foot slipped on the rain-soft ground as he ducked around the corner. He stumbled, found footing, and raced toward the back of the jail. Other guns had opened up. The lynch crowd was milling in excitement and uncertainty, some of them not sure yet what was happening. Bat Jones dashed around to the side of the jail. Rip spun around, saw the big figure, the red spurting gun muzzle. The smile that bared his teeth was cold and hard as the 2 big .45s blasted and roared in his hands. The gambler and a man or two bolder than the rest were leading the wolf pack to kill. For years, Rip had been growing up for this moment. Music and a wild, surging excitement were in the 6 guns that blasted and bucked in his hands. Head and wounded arm were forgotten. Screaming lead fanned death about him, and he had no thought for it as he triggered at the gambler's shadowy figure at the front of the building. The men behind Bat Jones and others on the plank walk out front, dashed back and aside from the red gun muzzles that had suddenly turned on them. Bat jumped into the shadows beside the jail building, and then lurched out, staggering a step or two as he fell. "There he is, Eli," Rip yelled. Maybe he's the one. Excitement had him now, like whiskey running fire in his blood. Gun law they wanted, and gun law they'd get. The man behind the jail must have yelled several times before Rip heard him. "Campbell, you fool. Fork this horse." Then Rip realized he'd been standing there shouting for Bat Jones and the others to come and get him. They'd given him open space clear out into the street, and Bat Jones was huddled on the muddy ground where he had fallen. The man behind the jail was in the saddle and leading another saddled horse. Rip made a flying jump, clawed into the saddle, found the stirrups, and grabbed for the reins as the man spurred away, yelling, "This way." Cole Lark wasn't there. As he followed, Rip recognized the gray hat and black suit of the man he'd last seen in front of the hotel. "Are you Mitch Hall?" Rip called as he spurred alongside. "Shut up and ride. They'll be after us. This way." Mitch Hall galloped through an open lot away from the main street. Dogs ran barking at them. They passed lighted windows and staring figures in open doorways. Then they were past the last houses and corrals, racing into the south. "The old fellow said you'd go to Dripping Springs," Mitch Hall called. "Our herd won't get that far tonight. Thanks for the help. I'll make it all right now. I'm siding you. Pour it on." Miles out of town, east of the stage road, they reined up a second time. They were alone in the vast night. "Lost them," Mitch Hall decided. "This makes a second favor I owe you," Rip said. "Are you sure Cole Lark didn't get hurt?" "He had some business that'd keep him a while," said Mitch Hall. "He'll be all right." Miles farther on they crossed the Dripping Springs Trail, Rip guiding, and rode south and east for the Bear Wash Crossing and Black Butte. Rip's thoughts turned back to Judy Sheldon, young and anguished as she had again abruptly sided with him. Sheldon's sister was at the jail, Rip said aloud. Mitch Hall nodded. I saw her ride by the livery barn. By the looks of her horse, she'd come fast. Must have heard about her brother Jake. She found his body, Rip said. I met her there when I got the money belt to bring to the sheriff. That the way you got it? Rip told him what had happened, from Jump John's death to the lawyer's visit to the jail. I had an idea Sheldon's story was wrong, Mitch Hall said coolly. Good riddance to Jake. So Zeke Ringgold, Parson Pitts, and Sheldon are after your ranch. Those first two names are new. Gamblers, Mitch Hall said. Zeke Ringgold's good-looking, with a light mustache. He'd rob his own mother. I hear that Parson Pitts was in the poker game too. He's worse. They were friends of Sheldon back in Texas. Know plenty about them, don't you? Mitch Hall shrugged. I've been through Texas. What do you aim to do now? Maybe I'll have an idea by morning. You'd better, Mitch Hall remarked. Because Ben Sheldon will have ideas tonight. They were pushing the horses. By Mitch Hall's watch, it was past 1:30 when they forded the Bear Wash, miles south of Black Butte. By 3, they sighted the wan glow of the Meadowland wagon fire and hailed Ozzie Delaware, riding night trick on the bedded steers. Dudley had been buried, and the cattle thrown on a bed ground a mile or so away. Ozzie Delaware was profane with dismayed anger as he rode with them to the sleeping men near the fire. Crawl out. Eli's dead. Get out, all of you, and hear trouble. They came awake. Earl Crow, Stu Chance, Cy Perkins, Gene Dawes, Dozy the cook, and Gomez, the part Mexican wrangler with red hair who'd rather use a knife than a gun. And as fresh, damp wood sizzled on the fire, Gomez was as bitter as the rest when Rip told what had happened. Gene Dawes spoke the violent thought of every man. We'll ride in on them snakes. Damn, if I'd only gone along. Mitch Hall spoke coolly. Ben Sheldon's not there tonight. Half the town's still drunk enough to think Campbell your boss. Better wait. You think we do nothing for this? Gomez said angrily. I'm waiting for this man Cole Lark, Rip said. We'll want good horses ready. Dozy, how about some coffee? The rest of you better sleep it out till daybreak. But there was no sleeping. Gun belts and rifles were brought to the fire and checked. Hot coffee warmed them, and questions were volleyed at Rip until all details were known. If that damned lawyer gets here, he'll talk. Gene harshly promised. He'll talk. Rip agreed, and noticed Mitch Hall watching him reflectively. The man was younger than he'd seemed at first, and more of a mystery than ever. The steers grazed out as the false dawn gave way to the first faint gray. Mitch Hall had wrapped himself in a borrowed blanket and tarp and slept near the fire. Rip moved stiffly about, thinking. Even now, it was hard to believe that Eli was dead, that he himself was on his own now. Cole Lark hadn't appeared by the time Dozy called grub. The clouds were thinning. A scarlet sunrise colored the east. Mitch Hall rolled out of his blanket and joined Rip. Time enough for that old fellow to be here. I don't like it, Rip admitted. I should have stayed. They'd have hunted you down. That lawyer, said Rip, was my only chance to show crooked work. I'm outlawed. Sheldon'll make sure I'm hunted. Rip spoke savagely. Killing Ben Sheldon might make it worse. I'm through on this range, no matter what I do. Going to quit and run. What's it to you? Rip said curtly. Mitch Hall was silent for a moment before he drawled. Judy Sheldon helped her brothers take out from stock detectives who were ready to send them to the pen. One of the detectives had been fool enough to tell her, hoping she'd understand what he had to do. She didn't tell her brothers he wasn't the gambler they thought he was. But after they were safely gone, Judy told the man she was through with him. She'd never marry anyone who might take her brothers to court. She'd never marry anyway and disgrace a husband with her brothers, she said. She was young and broken up, and she meant it. He had to leave. And a year later, he came back. Judy's mother was dead of heartbreak, they said, and Judy had gone west to the Screwjack country. He came after her and found she'd joined her brothers and hadn't changed her mind. So he stayed around to see if the brothers wouldn't hang themselves by their own cussedness after folks found them out. "And you're hoping this will do it," Rip guessed. "Hoping like hell," Mitch Hall drawled, "since I'm hogtied and helpless because of Judy." "I wondered about you," Rip admitted. "Maybe we'll both have luck." They were eating when Dozy called from the grub wagon, "Who's a-coming?" Riders had topped the slope to the west, 4 riders loping toward the wagon. One man wore a white sombrero that brought Rip to his feet. "That's Sheldon, the sheriff," Rip said grimly. Chapter 11. Ed picked up his rifle. "Sit tight, Rip. They ain't going to get you," Rip grinned coldly. "Meet him on the other side of the wagon. I'll keep out of sight for a minute." Mitch Hall joined Rip behind the wagon. "He's fast with a gun," he warned. "There's only 3 men with him, but he rode out of Bear Wash with 9 or 10 last night." Rip looked past the wagon seat. "Ain't that the card sharp Parson Pitts with him?" "And Leif Cantwell and Montana Jack," said Mitch Hall, looking. "They're killers." Standing there behind the wagon, they heard Gene greet the newcomers. "Howdy, gents. I'm Sheriff Sheldon. Mr. Pitts here took over the Meadowland last night. I've seen the papers Walker gave, and you can deal with Pitts from now on." "Eli Walker will tell us that." The gambler's nasal voice said, "Walker's dead. Shot by one of his own men named Campbell. The sheriff's got Campbell locked up in Bear Wash for trial. Walker lost his ranch in a card game before he was killed. You men can have your pay and move on this morning." Ozzie Delaware's voice exploded high and angrily. "No tin-horn gambler that oughta got what this Jake Sheldon got fires me from anywhere while I got a hoglag to talk." A gunshot blotted out the rest of his defiance, and Ozzie slid to the ground in an inert heap. Gene shouted, "That man murdered him, Sheriff. He pulled a gun on a deputy." Ben Sheldon rasped back, "Throw down them guns and step back while we take over. Who's that behind the wagon?" Rip thumbed both guns as he dived for the end of the wagon. No time now to plan further. Ozzie Delaware's foolish outburst had set off a killer's gun, and hell had started. Hell that would leave Ben Sheldon running the Bear Wash country, or stop him here in the Scarlet Dawn. Sheldon was waiting. His gun blasted as Rip plunged into the open behind the wagon. The big smoke-blackened coffee pot flew off the tailboard and showered Rip with hot coffee. And as a second shot roared on the heels of the first, Sheldon recognized the bandaged head that should have been back in Bear Wash in jail or on the end of a lynch rope. Sheldon yelled and missed the second shot clean. The drive of his spurs sent his horse bolting, with Meadowland men between him and Rip's guns. Rip fired over their heads and missed the running horse and crouching figure. The slam of a bullet in his left arm, already wounded, knocked him half around. That lead came from the gunman that Mitch Hall had pointed out as Montana Jack. The numbing shock left the arm useless as Rip got his other gun up again. Montana Jack had fired hastily as he reined his horse away. Now he was spurring away after the others. Rip stumbled past Cy Perkins and Earl Crow and aimed carefully as he emptied the old wooden-handled .45. Montana Jack lurched in the saddle, grabbed the horn and rode on, wounded but clinging tight to the saddle. Around Rip, guns were crashing, but the targets were moving fast out of range, scattering as they went. Mitch Hall ran past Rip with a rifle and took careful aim. He fired once and missed, coolly levered another cartridge in and aimed again. His target was the gaunt Parson Pitts, who was riding in a crouch, black coat tails flapping in the wind. Mitch Hall's rifle cracked a second time, and a second time he seemed to miss. His angry exclamation was audible as he hastily reloaded. Then a wild Indian yell came from Gomez. The flapping black coat tails were leaving the saddle. Parson Pitts was sliding over, clawing weakly at the saddle horn. Then he seemed to stiffen as he pitched from the saddle. "Look!" Stewchance shouted. The gambler's head and shoulders had hit the damp ground and bounced. And bounced again and again. The shooting had stopped. Around Rip, the men stood frozen, as the gambler's foot stayed caught in the stirrup and he dragged under the driving hoofs of the maddened horse. Rip thought he heard a thin, far, horrible scream from under the running horse. He wasn't sure. It came no more. The dragging body was limp now, and the coat tails had dropped down over the head, and were flapping grotesquely as flying hoofs shredded cloth and flesh and bone. "Shoot the horse!" Rip cried hoarsely. Mitch Hall already had the rifle up. He took his time before squeezing the trigger, and dropped the horse, kicking and helpless, near the top of the slope. The inert body was pinned underneath. "He come askin' for it," Jean said harshly. "But damned if I wish any man that." Sheldon and the other two men were out of sight now. There had been no time to look to Ozzie Delaware, who had dragged himself over against the hind wheel of the wagon. Rip could feel the warm blood over his arm as he stooped by Ozzie Delaware's round, drawn face. "How bad is it, Ozzie?" Ozzie Delaware tried to grin. "Busted up a rib and missed the lung, I think. I don't feel no blood in my throat. We showed them where to get off, didn't we? Ain't that blood on your arm, Rip?" "Nothing to think about. Get flat on the ground and let's have a look." And Rip called over his shoulder, "Get the horses. There's something funny about that sheriff only bringing 3 men. I don't," he broke off, demanding, "What's that?" Gomez was nearest the back of the wagon, and he too had heard the sudden rolling stamp of hoofs, the high alarmed bellow of startled cattle. Then a fusillade of shots before Gomez could speak. "Stampede!" Gomez yelled, bolting for his horse. Chapter 12. Under the wagon, Rip caught a glimpse of the cattle coming in a senseless wave of rushing bodies and clashing horns. They'd been started and pointed by a thin line of riders who had come down on them from the east. Now it was plain why Ben Sheldon had come with only 3 men, why the Meadowland men had been told to get their time, why Sheldon hadn't stood his ground to fight. Sheldon had parleyed, while other riders had circled around to get set for surprise and trouble. The wagon offered some shelter, but the stampede would carry away their horses. They'd be afoot and helpless around the wagon, cold targets for hidden men whose rifles could pick them off one by one. "Ride it out," Rip shouted. "Take your guns." There was still Ozzie Delaware, helpless on the ground, and for the moment all but forgotten. Rip jumped toward him. Mitch Hall got there first, shouting as he lifted Ozzie Delaware's chunky figure. "Hit the saddle, Campbell. I'll do this." Rip lingered to make sure, while the bawling tornado of frightened steers bore down on the spot. The saddled horses that had stayed ground-tied near the wagon through the shooting were catching the panic too, and starting to move as the Meadowland men plunged to them. Mitch Hall all but threw Ozzie Delaware into the front of the wagon. Rough treatment, but Ozzie would have to take it. Rip ran for his horse and it bolted. Then Stewchance came spurring, stooped far over, caught the dragging reins and yanked the horse over to Rip. Gene Dawes had seen how things were with Mitch Hall, and had gotten his horse and was bringing it at a run. Rip's arm was still numb to the shoulder. He had to get into the saddle one-handed. He saw blood running over the wrist and fingers as his feet found the stirrups, and his good hand took the slack out of the reins. Then the first of the bawling, thundering stampede was on them, and the horse needed no spurring as it raced away. Over his shoulder, Rip saw Mitch Hall's horse stumble as a big steer brushed it, and then settle into stride. There was no dust. Ben Sheldon's men were playing at the rear of the stampede. 9 or 10 of them, at least, shooting forward over the cattle. They had failed to put the Meadowland men afoot. Now they were trying to gun them from their horses. A wild yell over to the right dragged Rip's look. He cursed helplessly as he saw Earl Crow pitching out of the saddle. Earl's horse kept on. Earl stayed under the torrent of running steers. Ben Sheldon wanted it this way for anyone who stood in the way of his law. Gun law. Sheldon law that could wipe out an old man like Eli Walker and all who tried to stand up to him. Rip cut over toward Gene and Stu Chance, who were following Gomez and Mitch Hall to the west flank of the stampede. Dozy and Cy Perkins were coming also. They were outnumbered. If they scattered now, they'd stay scattered. The Meadowland land and cattle would be in other hands. Looking back, Rip could see the gunmen bunching up to follow them. Ben Sheldon and the 2 men with him evidently hadn't circled fast enough to swing in behind the stampede. Mitch Hall rode close. Looks like Sheldon pulled a trick that'll be hard to beat. They were plunging over a brushy ridge now, with the stampede swerving off over the lower ground. The Sheldon men were following up the slope, shooting as Rip called, "Ain't a chance to whip that bunch. Scatter the boys and keep riding. Sheldon's men'll give up after a few miles." Mitch Hall nodded. His look was regretful, disappointed. Rip Campbell was quitting after all his talk of blocking Sheldon. They topped the ridge and raced down through the brush, hidden for a little from the guns behind. Rip lagged, swinging to the left. Mitch Hall caught up with Gene and the others, urging them ahead. Dozy and Cy Perkins passed on as Rip pulled his horse hard over along the ridge paralleling the top. Brush and low trees closed in behind him. When he'd ridden 150 yards and pulled up, the others were out of sight, crashing on down the slope. Rip dismounted behind low bushes as the Sheldon men topped the ridge in a bunch, quirting, spurring after the fleeing riders ahead. They swept on down the slope, without looking toward the brush where Rip waited. Blood covered Rip's left hand, and the throbbing hurt went up into the shoulder. But he could use the hand a little, and reload both 6 guns. His rifle was back in bare wash. He was in the saddle again, when he heard another coming. The man cut the ridge, and took the slope. His hat was black. He showed in the clear for an instant, and he was the gunman deputy that Mitch Hall had called Leif Cantwell. Ragged bursts of gunfire marked the running fight moving off into the west. No one followed Cantwell, as Rip put his horse into a run south along the ridge. Minutes later, the distant gunfire in the west seemed to double in intensity, as if the Meadowland men had been caught and had turned to fight. Rip fought down the urge to head that way fast. His grim face was lined with strain as he kept on. The grub wagon was out there on the sun-drenched flat. Parson Pitt's horse was dead and had been rolled off the body. 2 saddled horses stood restlessly nearby, and the 2 men near the body were talking with some heat. Zeke Ringgold, handsome, well-dressed, had a neck sling supporting his left arm. His voice was angrily clear as Rip stepped behind a small tree and listened. "You're talking a lot, but it don't change me, Sheldon. I shot that damn lamp out last night and put the lead in the old coot's back and got a bullet in my arm for it. I've earned the parson's share, and I want it for the time I'll be laid up from gambling. The idea was mine and the parson's in the first place," Sheldon rasped. "There ain't too much to go around as it is, with that lawyer cutting in for his share. You can't claim the Meadowland, Sheldon. There'll be enough talk as it is. That greasy little lawyer ain't to be trusted, and Bat hasn't got the head or tongue for this. You've got to have me to handle the Meadowland. I'll have my price for it, or nobody cashes in. Savvy?" "Bat don't think fast, but he'll do what he's told," Ben Sheldon sneered. "Zeke, you've grown a big head for a young fellow. Zeke Ringgold jumped back, grabbing under his coat. Then the vomiting six-gun in Ben Sheldon's hand slammed him against the earth, and he stayed there, trying weakly to get his gun out. Sheldon tore the gun from him, threw it away, and grinned down at the dying man. "That's your cut, Zeke. The parson and me was saving it for you." Sheldon was not 100 yards away, back partly turned to the crest of the slope as Rip stepped out toward him. "I'll take your money belt." "You won't need it," Sheldon said as he knelt by the young gambler. He had jerked the money belt out and was getting to his feet when Rip spoke. "I've brought your cut, Sheldon." Ben Sheldon whirled around, and for an instant his angular face was stunned, unbelieving. Then he hurled the belt aside, and his pearl-handled gun streaked from the holster, blasting as it came out. Rip's gun met shot for shot, handicapped by the sun into which he was facing. A bullet nicked his ear. Sheldon staggered as lead tore into his leg. His gun emptied as he reached for Zeke Ringgold's gun, and he made a lurching dive and caught up the gambler's gun. One-handed, Rip dropped his empty gun and caught the other from under his belt without stopping his advance. That broke Ben Sheldon's nerve. He made a limping break for his horse, which jumped back nervously. Rip ran forward. He had 3 shots left, and no time to reload if Sheldon started riding. Sheldon got the reins and cursed the horse wildly as he caught the saddle and swung awkwardly up. For an instant, he was silhouetted against the blazing morning sun. Rip stopped, steadied, and emptied the second gun in a roaring roll of shots that hurled Ben Sheldon out of the saddle in a sprawling fall as the horse bolted away. Rip stood grimly by the man as he died. He had had the feeling, when he sighted Sheldon a few minutes back, that it would end this way. Sheldon died first, with Zeke Ringgold lying on his side, staring at the sight with a thin, fixed grin. Rip looked around. His voice was husky. "Eli, I didn't aim to make the start this way. You figure it out." He went back for his horse and rode to the wagon. Ozzie Delaware was still alive. He'd keep on living. Ozzie was on the ground again, with his shirt off, when the first of a straggling line of riders swept down on them. Gene and Mitch Hall were leading. Close behind them galloped the buckskin-clad figure of old Cole Lark. "Don't know what happened, but it looks good," Rip said to Ozzie Delaware. The riders were around them a few moments later. Strange faces riding up. Smiling faces that gathered around while Cole Lark leapt down, brandishing an old rifle and whooping, "How's this for fixing your business, boy? I caught that snaky little law talker in his office as he was affixing to ride to Sheldon's ranch. Sawed a knife against his throat, and he talked, and give me the papers Eli signed and left with him. He squealed as how them gamblers and a sheriff's posse was coming to get your cattle at daybreak, all legal and nice." Cole spat again and continued, "I'd taken him to the young doc to tell his story. Sheldon's sister was there, a-talking already. They studied the papers Eli signed, and heard the lawyer talk again, and the doc run out to see men he said he'd like to know all this. Took some time to get them all together, and stop at a ranch or two for more men, afore we come a-riding hard to meet the sheriff at his dirty work. And we met a running gunfight, and heard the news. How bad you hurt, boy?" "Not bad," Rip said. "The sheriff's dead. He killed Zeke Ringgold and shot it out with me. When I got a good look back and saw that Sheldon wasn't with his men," Mitch Hall said, "I had an idea maybe you still had him on your mind after all. We headed this way, as quick as possible." And he said slowly, "So Ben's dead at last." "Come help haze them steers back, mister," Cole Lark urged Mitch Hall. "And then we'll get to Bear Wash and celebrate. Wasn't there some business you had to see about quick in Bear Wash this morning?" Rip said to Mitch Hall, "Some Texas business you never finished." "I'll help here first, Campbell. Steers can wait, and my business is mostly settled," Rip said, grinning faintly. "Not knowing about such things, I'd say your business has waited long enough. I'm obliged for everything, and good luck in Bear Wash." The end. Do you like wild Western adventure? Can I send you a full-length novel free? Get your copy today. Rather, listen. I have over 30 Wild Western audiobooks you can hear for free. Saddle up and click play today. Can I send you Wrangler for free?